Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Gospel at Work conference. Sorry about the coffee situation. I know some of us are dependent on it. I'm dependent on coffee, so hope you can just stick toothpicks in your eyes or something until the coffee gets here. Glad you're here. I don't know how many of you have a talent for staying awake without coffee. I don't have that kind of talent, but I bet that everybody in the room would identify something in your life that you would say, "Hey, this is a talent of mine. This is something that God has given me." I want you to think about that for just a second and actually answer the question. It's not rhetorical. List out in your mind 2 or 3 things in your head that you would say, "I think these are talents that the Lord has given me." Now, if you're a Christian, then probably as you think about those things, you would say, "Yeah, if these are the talents, then I want to capitalize on these things well. I want to do these things in a good way for the glory of God." Some of your talents are probably related to your work. Some of your talents are probably just stupid party tricks that you can do. Some of your talents are probably sports talents. I don't know. I don't know what you think of when you think of talents. But I want you to think about those things and just kind of list them out in your head, because that's what I want to talk with you about this morning for a few minutes, are the talents that God has given to us. You got them? Raise your hand if there's something in your head that you think the Lord has given you as a talent. That should be everybody in the room. Okay. Even if you don't think yours are very good. Well, what if I told you just right up front that probably, I think for 95%, 90% of the people in the room, the things that you have listed out in your head as talents that God has given you are probably not at all what the Bible is talking about when it talks about talents. It's probably a different category of thing altogether. And I want to try to show you from the most famous place in the Bible where Jesus talks about talents, why that is. So if you've got a Bible, let me invite you to turn over to Matthew chapter 25. And we're going to be looking at a really famous parable that Jesus told in the last week of his life. Now, just in order to get us set on what's going on in this parable, because the Bible doesn't work like a sort of grab bag of just unrelated stories. It's one big story, and the book of Matthew is one big story about the life of Jesus. So if you want to really understand what's going on in the parable of the talents, you got to understand kind of what's happening in the story. Well, what's happening in the story is that we've come in Matthew chapter 25 to the last week of Jesus' life. So this is just a few days before he's going to be crucified on the cross and then be resurrected on the following Sunday. And what's going on is that from chapter 21, middle of 21, beginning of 22, all the way through, say, chapter 25, 26, Jesus is giving one long speech to his disciples about what life is going to be like after he's gone. So he tells them that the time is coming, and it's coming very rapidly, when I'm going to be put on the cross, and then the Father is going to take me back to heaven after the resurrection, and this is going to happen. The disciples naturally sort of ask, "Well, Lord, if you're leaving us, then what's life going to be like after you're gone?" And Jesus tells them in this long speech what life is going to be like. It's going to be rough, he says. There are going to be wars, rumors of wars. You're going to be persecuted. All this stuff is going to be happening. At the same time, though, that you're being persecuted and the church is being beat down and all the rest, the gospel also of the message of Jesus and his kingdom and his salvation is also going to be going out to the whole world. So the church is going to be persecuted. The gospel is going to be going out. And so that's what the world is kind of going to look like until Jesus comes back the second time. The disciples, again, naturally say, "Okay, Lord, but if that's what's going to be happening during the period between your 2 comings, the first one and then the second one, when history comes to an end, well, how long is that going to be?" And Jesus answers and says, "Well, nobody knows. The Father alone knows. The angels in heaven don't know." He says, I don't even know right now when that's going to be. The Father alone knows. And the implication of that is, well, it could be a long time. So it's not just going to be, 24 hours or 48 hours. There could be a really long time that you have to wait for me to come back. So the disciples again ask, "Okay, well, if it could be a long time," I mean, we're going on, 2,000 years now of time between the 2 comings of Jesus. The disciples ask, "Okay, well, what, Lord, do you want us to be doing in the meantime? If we got to wait on you, if you're coming back someday, and if it could be a really long time, what should we be doing?" And essentially, Jesus tells them 2 things. Number one, in the parable just before this one, he says, you should be ready. No matter when it comes, no matter how fast, no matter how suddenly, you should be ready for the moment when I come back. And the second thing he tells them is the parable of these talents that we're going to look at today. So Matthew chapter 25, and I'm just going to start reading it in verse 14. We're going to read the whole parable as Jesus tells it. And then we're just going to talk about it. I'm going to explain some things about the parable. And then I want to give you kind of 6 applications that have to do particularly with our topic for today, being a Christian in the workplace. So verse 14 of Matthew chapter 25. Here's what Jesus said. For it, that's kind of all of this that he's been talking about. For all of this will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability, and then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. And so also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. He who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, and said, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I've made you 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward and said, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I've made you 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you didn't sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. So here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Well, even then, you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now that's easily one of the most famous parables that Jesus ever told. There are a few in the Bible that are just super famous. The Good Samaritan is super famous. You don't even have to be a Christian really to have heard about that one. This parable of the talents is also one of those that's just really, really famous and well known. But I think one of the reasons it's so well known is because we slightly, maybe even in a big way, misunderstand exactly what Jesus is talking about here. The reason we misunderstand it is because we have an English word, talent, in our own language that matches up to a word in this parable. And in fact, probably our English word talent comes from this parable. In our English language, the word talent means, we all know this, it means something like a special ability or a special aptitude to do something. And so what we managed to do is take that English definition of the word talent and read it into this parable. And we think that what the master is doing in this parable is doling out to his servants special aptitudes and special abilities. So to this servant, he gave the ability to play baseball really well and to play the viola really well and the cello and also to do computer repair. That's what this guy gets. And he's a 5-talent sort of guy, a really gifted dude. Then this guy who's slightly less talented, and then you've got your poor 1-talent guy who has a great ability to play the piano, but actually hides it under a rock and doesn't use it, and the master gets really angry that he didn't develop that talent for playing the piano at the second coming, right? That's how you typically interpret that parable. That's what we think it's doing. That's not what's happening in the parable, though. It's way more important than that. It's not just a sort of lesson from Jesus to all human beings about the self-actualization of their special abilities. That's not what he's doing. And if you remember kind of the story I was telling you about the speech Jesus is giving, he's not even really talking to all human beings at all. He's talking to his people about how they are supposed to conduct themselves in the time in between his 2 comings. And he's given them very specific instructions about, here's what I want you to be doing. Okay, so if it's not all that, then what is it? Well, here's a couple of reasons why. First of all, let's just start by kind of deprogramming our normal way of approaching the parable. So why can't this be just special abilities and aptitudes that the master's doling out? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, just to set the stage a bit, is that the word talent in Greek had nothing to do with special abilities. So it was a unit of measurement. And in fact, it was a unit of measurement usually of metal. So you would talk about, a talent of gold, which would be really, really valuable, or a talent of silver, which would be really valuable too, but not as valuable as gold. But that's the way they measured metals in particular. So if you were a Greek-speaking person and somebody came up to you and said the word talent, the first thing that comes into your mind is not, computer repair. The first thing that comes into your head is a great sum of money, a lot of gold or a lot of silver, unit of measurement for metal. Also, I want you to look really carefully at one verse, because I think this one verse makes it impossible, actually, that these are abilities that the master's doling out. It's verse 15. So look real carefully at verse 15. You see it says there, to one of his servants the master gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Now there's the word ability right there at the end of that sentence. And what a lot of us do a lot of times is that we'll read that sentence as saying something like, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, and those were abilities. That's how we kind of read that, because the word shows up there. But you see, that's not what it says. It says he gave 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent, and he gave those talents according to their ability. So if we read our understanding of talent, our English language word, which means ability, back into the text and sort of replace the word talents there for abilities, you end up with something like this. To one he gave 5 abilities, to another 2 abilities, to another 1 ability, and he gave them those abilities according to their abilities, which doesn't make any sense at all. Right? Doesn't make any sense. It's like saying, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2 talents, to another 1 talent, to each according to his talents. It's redundant. It just doesn't make sense. You wouldn't say that. So it can't be that the talents there represent abilities, because the talents are given according to the abilities that the guy already had. All right, so what are they? What are the talents? If there's not these special aptitudes, what are they? Well, I think the talents here are more correctly seen as all the responsibilities and opportunities that God has given you in this period of your life. It's not just special abilities, not just special aptitudes, but it's every single responsibility, every single opportunity that the Lord has put into your life right now. Those are the things that He has entrusted to you for this season of your life, in this period of waiting for Him to return. Now here's the danger of thinking of these talents as special abilities. The danger in thinking of the talents as special abilities is that you get all fired up because you know from this parable that whatever the talents are, the master cares deeply about those. The master cares deeply. Whatever these talents are, he wants us to be about the work of capitalizing on those talents. Now, if you think that the only thing that's referring to are the things that you're really good at and really passionate about, you're going to be leaving out a whole lot of your life that you think the master doesn't care about quite so much as he cares about this one particular thing, or these 5 particular things. But you understand that that's not what's going on, and that the talents are actually everything God has given you in terms of responsibilities and opportunities. It changes everything, because all of a sudden, even the thing that you're not so good at, that God has given you to do in this period of your life, becomes massively important to Him. Even the thing that you're not so passionate about, that God has still given you to do in this portion of your life, becomes massively important to Him. So you see how it changes the whole paradigm of the parable? God doesn't just care about the things that you care about. He cares about the things that He cares about, and He's given you a whole bunch of things that He cares about for you to do, whether you really care about them or not. And our calling as Christians is to do them well. So in my own church, I like to give a sentence or two of main idea. And if I'm doing this thing of interpreting the Bible correctly in a talk or in a sermon, then the main point of this parable ought to become the main point of what we're talking about during these 40 or 45 minutes here. So here I think is the main idea that Jesus is trying to get across to His disciples and therefore to us. While you wait for the return of Jesus, and you ought to be waiting for it. I mean, we ought to be, as Christians, that ought to be the great hope of our lives. But while we wait for the return of Jesus, work. While you wait, work. And do that with energy and with faithfulness and with love for your King. While you wait, work and do it with energy and faithfulness and love for your King. And I'm not just talking there about churchy things. I'm not just talking about churchy responsibilities, churchy opportunities. You know, some people are really gifted at teaching a Sunday school class or doing music or standing up in front of a bunch of people and talking. Some people are able to do that, and God has given them responsibility and opportunity to do that. That's true. But this parable is not just talking about those things. It's talking about everything. And in particular, for our purposes today, it's talking about your work. Whether that's a high-powered executive job or whether it's a not-so-high-powered other kind of job or whether it's something completely different than any of that, whatever the Lord has given you to do in this particular period of your life, that's what it's talking about. And while you wait for Jesus, you're to do that work. You're to capitalize on those talents with energy and with faithfulness and with love for your King. So what we're going to do is look in a little more detail at this parable and just kind of run through the story. And then I want to give you 6 points of application for you to think about as we kind of go through the day. There are a couple little points in the story that tend to trip Christians up, and so I want to kind of smooth those out for you if I can. And but then we're gonna look at 6 points of application. And my prayer is that as we've gathered here today for the next few hours to talk about our work and the way that can glorify God and the way we can engage our work in a way that glorifies God, I pray you'll be encouraged to, wait for your King to come back. You know, look with eager expectation for the King to come back. But until then, be busy. Burn up your life in service to Him. So here's the thing about the story. It's not a difficult story. Essentially, the idea is that you've got a master who is about to go away on a long journey. And so he calls 3 of his servants to him. And he's obviously a wealthy master. He calls these 3 servants up to him, and he's going to give his servants a certain amount of money, these talents. Probably it's silver, because a talent of gold would just be massive, massive amounts of money. So it's probably silver. And if you start doing the math and you understand what a talent was, essentially a talent was about a year's wages for a worker. So, you know, you factor in inflation and currency exchanges and all the rest, and let's just estimate it. A talent is like $40,000. Let's just go with that. So one guy, he calls up in front of him, and he gives 5 talents of silver, which is probably the equivalent of something like $200,000. Not an insignificant amount of money, but it's also not like $1 trillion or something like that. But the point's not the amount of money anyway. The point is that the master has called this servant up, and he's given him a significant amount of responsibility to handle while the master's gone on his trip. So this guy gets $200,000. He calls a second guy up, gives him 2 talents, and that's something like $80,000. And he calls up one other guy, gives him $40,000, which is also not an insignificant amount of money. We read the story sometimes and think, oh, that poor guy who got 1 talent, he got like nothing. Well, not true. He got $40,000 to invest. So the master's called him up, called these 3 guys up. They're probably his 3 top servants. He gives them these amounts of money, and he says, what I want you to do is go put that money to work. The responsibility that I've given you here, capitalize on it, use it, and when I return, you're going to give an account to me. So the king goes away for a long time. 2 of the guys put the money to work, and they make money on it. The 3rd guy goes and hides the money away and buries it underground or somewhere else. And anyway, the master comes back after a very long time, and he calls his servants to him because they're going to give an account to him. So the first guy comes. He's got $200,000, and he says, Master, while you were away, I put your $200,000 to work. I built a business, did some trade, whatever it was. It's just a story that Jesus is telling anyway, so it doesn't matter. But he calls him up and says, I put your money to work, and I've made $200,000 more dollars, 5 more talents. So, Master, here is $400,000. that I'm giving you on your return. Second guy comes up. He says the same thing. I put your money to work. Had the same rate of return as the other guy. Here's 160 grand, master, that I'm returning to you. The master says, well done. Good job. Well done. So the third guy comes up, and he says, Master, I didn't put your money to work because I knew that you were a hard man. I knew that you are an unfair man. I know that you reap where you didn't sow. I know that you take crops from people. I know that you're angry. I know that you're unfair. I know that you're ruthless with people. I know all those things about you, Master. And so I was scared of you. I didn't want to mess up. And so I took your $40,000. I buried it in the ground. I didn't lose it. So nothing happened to it. And here it is, all $40,000 back to you. Now this is where we get tripped up, because everybody knows, if you're a Christian and you know this parable, you know that this master is supposed to represent God, right? He represents Jesus. And yet you look down here at verse 26 and 27, after the servant has insulted this God figure. And it looks in 26 and 27 to a lot of us like the God figure is agreeing with the guy, right? Looks like he's saying, yep, you're exactly right. I am ruthless. I reap where I haven't sowed. I gather where I scattered no seed. I am unfair to people, and you're right. You should have been scared of me. You should have put my money in the bank. And it trips us up. We're like, why in the world is God admitting that he's like unfair and ruthless to people? I don't think that's what he's doing, though. I think what the master is doing here is not agreeing with the guy, but he's being sarcastic with him. You know, and you might have picked up on it as I read it. I think he's kind of getting down in his face and saying, "Oh, really? You knew, did you, that I'm ruthless, that I'm unfair, that I reap where I haven't sown, that I gather where I scatter no seed? You knew that? Well, even if you did know that, even if that were true, you should have put my money in the bank, and I would have at least gotten it back with interest." So I don't think he's agreeing with him. He's just saying, "Look, if you even thought that of me, you would have done this and not what you did." Well, the very end of the story tends to trip people up too. In verse 28 there, the master says, take the talent from the one who didn't make any money on it. Give it to the one who has 10 talents. To everyone who has will more be given. All that. Verses 28 and 29. That trips people up. But what Jesus is doing there is that he's as he does at the end of his parables a lot of times, that he's pulling up out of this fictional story that he's been telling, and he's putting the whole thing on the realm of reality. So when he says, take the little bit of money that I gave and give it to another one, what he's essentially saying there is that this guy's lack of effort in the responsibility showed him not to be a true disciple of the Master of Jesus. And so that means that if he's not a true disciple, he gets nothing. You know, it's like you may have heard of the book that Jesus plus nothing equals everything. You know, well, it's also true that Jesus plus anything equals nothing, or no Jesus plus anything equals nothing. If you don't have Jesus, you have nothing. And that's the point that Jesus is making there. You don't even get a kind of consolation prize if you're not a true servant of the master. And then at the very end of it, there in 30, I've heard people say before that it's just incomprehensible that this servant in the story would be thrown into what is obviously hell, into the outer darkness, and in a place where we're weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's not, though, because Jesus is pulling up out of the fiction. And he's saying, if you don't have me, Jesus, you have nothing. And in fact, as he's been telling us throughout his entire ministry, you get judged by God in this place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. So don't let the fact that Jesus ends his parables with spiritual reality throw you as you try to make the details of the fiction line up with reality. Jesus always pulls out at the end, sets it on the realm of reality. So the point of the whole thing is to say to his disciples, and therefore to say to us, during this time of delay between Jesus' resurrection and ascension into heaven and his coming back to take us home as Christians, he's saying, don't be apathetic. Don't be unfaithful during that waiting time. You be energetic and faithful with the responsibilities that God has given. Now, there's a ton that we can learn from this. Just all kinds of applications that we're going to be talking about, actually all day today about how this works out. But just as a way to kind of launch the conference this morning, I want to give you 6 applications. 6 different things that I think just by observing what Jesus is saying here, we can apply pretty directly to our own lives and especially to our own jobs. So here's number 1. I'll just give them to you as we go instead of giving them up front. But here's number 1, first application. I just want you to notice from this parable that Jesus is making it clear that all responsibilities and opportunities are God's to give. And he gives them unequally. You see that? This is a really important point. All responsibilities and opportunities, that is, all talents, are God's to give, and he gives them unequally. It's the very first detail that you notice about the parable. One guy, 3 servants come up, one guy gets 5, one guy gets 2, and one guy gets 1. Now, as good Americans who are all about equality, we look at that and say, that's unfair. And it would have been much better if the master had realized that he had 8 talents that he was going to give out and 3 servants, and therefore each one of them should have gotten 2.666667 or whatever it ends up being, talents. He should have divided it equally, and our hackles get up because we think the master's being unfair. He ought to have distributed this whole thing more fairly. But Jesus seems to be at pains here and other places in the Bible to sort of break that expectation of equality in his disciples. He's just constantly telling them that the responsibilities that God gives, the gifts that God gives, even the rewards that God gives at the end, you don't have any claim on them. They're all God's to give, and He gives them out unequally. He teaches this actually in another parable just a few chapters back, in chapter 20, when he's not talking about talents or these responsibilities, but he's talking about the rewards that come at the end. And if you remember the parable, what happens is that the master goes out into the marketplace at the beginning of the day, and he gets a few workers and sends them out into the field. They're supposed to work the field. And he tells them, at the end of the day, at the end of 12 hours of work, I'm going to give you a denarius, which is perfectly fair pay. So it's 1 day's wage. They're going to do a day's wage. They're going to do a day's work, and they're going to get a day's wage. So that's perfectly fair. Well, at various intervals throughout the day, then the master goes back to the marketplace, gets more people, and sends them out into the field also, without really telling them what he's going to give them. So he sends them out, some at the 3rd hour, some at the 6th hour, some at the 9th hour. Finally, he goes to the marketplace when there's only like 1 hour left in the entire day, like the sun's going down. And everybody else has been out there all day long. And he says, I want you to go out into my field. So off they go into the field to work the 1 hour of the day. Well, then they all line up in this parable to get their pay. But the master has his other servants line them up in reverse order. So he's standing here. The line is out there, but the guys at the front of the line are the ones that worked 1 hour. It's all they worked. And the full day laborers are all the way at the back, the guys who worked 12. So the guys come up, and the master starts to hand out the pay. And to the guys who just worked 1 hour, he hands them an entire denarius, a whole day's wage for 1 hour of labor. So he gives it to the guy, and the guy's like, "Oh my goodness, you got to be kidding me!" Because he's giving him almost 2 weeks worth of wages for an hour. Or he's giving him, like, if you work it out, it's a denarius an hour, so 2 weeks there worth of wages, and he gives it to the guy. Well, you can imagine what happens down the rest of the line, right? I mean, the guys at the end of the line are going, oh my goodness. The master is paying 1 denarius an hour. We worked 12 hours. So at the end of this, he's going to give us 12 denariuses. Or denarii, or however you want to say that. We're going to get the whole 2 weeks' wages at the end of this thing. Well, the line keeps going, and he gets to the end, and he gives them all, not 12, but he gives them 1. And they're incensed. What in the world? You gave those guys a denarius an hour, and you're giving us a denarius a day. What's up with that? You remember what the master says to them? He says, look, my money is mine to give. I told you that if you worked a day, I'd give you a day's wages. I'm not defrauding you. I'm not doing anything unjust to you. I'm doing what you and I agreed to. If I want to be merciful and give more to somebody else, is that not my business? See, all the money, all the rewards is the point of that one, are God's to give it, and he gives them unequally. Paul seems to say the same thing when he's talking about gifts in the church. And when the Holy Spirit gives out gifts in the church, he makes this point to say, look, the Holy Spirit doesn't give them equally, right? I mean, some of us get to be mouths in the church. Fun, obvious job. More so for some of us than others. It's just mouths or big eyes. Some of us get to be eyes or arms, but some people have to be the left pinky toe. I mean, Paul just seems to be at pains to say to his readers, to say to us, God doesn't give these things equally. And what's going on is that he's trying to break this idea in our minds that God is somehow unfair to do that. So here's the point of that. What do you think of the responsibilities and opportunities that God has given you right now? Are you grateful for them? Are you jealous of the opportunities and responsibilities God has given to somebody across the room? Do you look at that guy or to that woman and say, wow, I wish I had that. I don't like what God has given me. I like what that person has, and I'd rather have that. Are you jealous? Do you want something different than what God has given you right now? I'm not saying that you can't aspire to other things. I'm not even saying that God doesn't change it sometimes, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But for this period in your life, for this moment in your life, the responsibilities and opportunities that you have right now are given to you by God. Now, maybe they'll change 30 seconds from now. Maybe you'll get a text on your phone that says your whole life has changed. That's possible. Maybe the responsibilities God has given you are going to sort of stick in place for a few years. Maybe it's going to take a little bit of activation energy from you for those responsibilities to change. But for right now, whatever's in your life in terms of your job, your responsibilities, your opportunities, they're yours and they're given to you by the King. So do them well with energy and faithfulness. That's the first thing. Here's the second thing. Whatever assignment you have, whatever set of responsibilities that you have right now in your life, you do all those things in service to the King. You're doing those things in service to the King. I mean, think about these guys in the parable. They would have had in their investment of the $200,000, $80,000, $40,000, they would have had to work with all kinds of people in investing that money. So the guy with $200,000 or the equivalent would have had to go buy ships, for example, or buy goods to be traded, or however he did that. He probably would have had clients and customers and all kinds of people that he had to interact with. But every single step of the way, no matter who he was working with or working for even at any given moment, he knew that his ultimate account was going to be given to his king when his king returned. Friends, that's the same thing with you. No matter who your boss is or your clients are, or your students are, or whatever's going on in your life, no matter who you think that you're supposed to finally give an account to, ultimately, account will be given by you to your King when he returns. Everything you do, you work for the King. I think when it comes to our assignments from the King, when it comes to especially our jobs, most of us tend to, 95% of the problems that we have in our thinking about our jobs, our engagement with our jobs, comes because of one of two different problems. Two different problems, I think, in our minds, in our hearts, that cause 95% of our trouble in the way we engage our jobs. One of those is that our hearts tend to make an idol of our jobs, an IDOL, something that we find significance in, something that we even worship. It becomes the main source of satisfaction, the main source of meaning, the main source of self-esteem in our lives. And so inexorably, inevitably, but powerfully over time, the idol of our job becomes the center of our life, and everything else has to organize around that and swirl around it. Family, church, friendships, everything organizes itself in our lives around the job because that's where our eyes are. A lot of us make an idol of our job. The other problem, I think, that helps to cause all these problems in the way we engage our jobs is that our hearts don't so much make an idol of the job, an IDOL, but our hearts become idle in the job, IDLE. Now, the Bible talks a lot about idleness in the job. I mean, this is where Paul says, if a man won't work, he's not going to eat, or let a man work with his hands and do something productive. So he's saying very clearly that you shouldn't be doing this base sort of, worst kind of idleness, which would be to sit at your desk and twiddle your thumbs and do absolutely nothing and collect a paycheck. That's the worst kind of idleness. Just very obvious. I doubt many people in the room today are in that kind of idleness. But the worst kind of idleness? I mean, if that's the basest sort of just low-level idleness is idleness of the hands. I think the more insidious and evil kind of idleness is a kind of idleness of the heart, where you just kind of lose sight completely of God's purposes for you in your job. I mean, do you realize that your job is not an accident? It's not something that God just kind of forgot about. It's not something it's not like God is just up there, okay, here's Greg. What should we do with him? I don't know. Bring the sack. Pastor, you go. He's not doing that. He's a sovereign God. The Bible says in Psalms that every day of your life is written in his book before it ever happens. It's an incredible thought. And that means that the day you got your job was written in his book before it happened. He knew what he was doing. It was part of his plan. I think it was Abraham Kuyper who said that something like, there's not 1 square inch of this universe over which the Lord Jesus Christ does not cry sovereignly, mine. Well, that's true. But it's also true that there's not 1 split second of your life over which the Lord Jesus Christ does not cry sovereignly, mine. Whatever you do, whatever assignment or deployment you might think of it as that God has given you, you do it for the King. And when you realize that, when you understand from Ephesians chapter 6 that says, work with a sincere heart, rendering service with a good will, as to the Lord and not to man. When you read Colossians 3:23, where Paul says, whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men. When you realize, I'm doing this service for the King, it just absolutely cuts the root of both idolatry of the job and idleness in the job. You see how that would happen? You don't have to think about it very long, because it does. When you realize that you work for the King, it's really hard, if you can keep that in mind, for the job to push out the King as being the center of everything. And the job becomes a wonderful, awesome means of glorifying the King, and that is its rightful place. Same thing happens over here with idleness. I mean, if you can keep front and center in your mind the fact that whatever you're doing, in your job, in your church, all of it, all the responsibilities, whatever you're doing it for the King. It's very hard to let your heart become idle in that job. I'm doing this for a purpose. I may not know what the purpose is, but I'm not the King either. He is. And He's given me this deployment for now. I'm going to do it well. Whatever you do, you work for the King. Here's number 3. Number 3, God normally calls us to areas of service that match up to our abilities. He normally calls us to areas of service that match up to our abilities. Remember verse 15 that we looked at a few minutes ago? You notice how the King gives these guys responsibility that is according to or commensurate with their abilities. In other words, He knew them. He knew what kind of abilities they had. He knew what kind of gifts they had. He knew what they were able to handle, and He gave them, in terms of talents, responsibility, He gave them precisely what their gifts and abilities had shown them able to handle. That's what He did in this parable. Now, that's not always the case in the Bible. Sometimes God gives people responsibilities in the Bible, we read about it, that are just far and away above what He seems to have prepared them for. There's stories all over the Bible like that. You think about, just one example would be Moses. Moses' problem was that he couldn't speak, right? He stuttered. And yet God called him far and away above his abilities, far and away above his gifting, to go speak to the most powerful man on the planet and say, let this entire nation of slaves that you have go. Let them go. And Moses said, I can't do that. And God said, you're going to do it. Called him to do something far and away above. Same thing with David. David, the little runt, called to destroy this 9-foot giant Goliath, far and away above his abilities. And that's the point in those stories. But there are also famous stories all over the Bible of God preparing people over a lifetime to do precisely the thing that He wanted them to do. And what He calls them to do ultimately, and what they were prepared for, are perfectly fitting. Think about the Apostle Paul. That dude was like scholar A+ guy. Studied with the smartest Jewish rabbi that was alive. He was a Pharisee. He had it all. He was a scholar. God had been preparing him. He studied the Old Testament every day of his life. God prepared him every day of his life to end up writing half the New Testament. Now, I think that, in fact, probably that, rather than the other thing, is the major pattern in the Bible. God normally calls us to areas of service that match up to our abilities. And here's the thing about that. We as Christians always want God, and we even end up expecting God to do that first incredible, amazing thing with us. I want to be the Moses guy. I know I'm not very gifted, right? But I want God to call me to do something that would require a lot of gifting, and I just want you, God, to supply the lack. But I want you to exalt me. I want to be the guy to go talk to the King. We expect God to do that first incredible thing with us rather than matching us up with things that match up with our abilities. And that expectation that God's going to do that huge thing can really lead Christians to be very bitter dead-enders. It can lead us actually to take the $40,000 or the $80,000 that God has actually given us and stick it on a shelf and say, you know what, neither I nor God really cares about that 40 grand because I want to be stewarding 200 grand. There's even times when we'll use the language of calling as Christians to justify our shelving the 40 grand. We'll say, yeah, the 40 grand is just for a season. That's just for a season. I am called, baby, to steward 200 grand, and I know it. Really? I mean, no. Look, you are only called to steward 200,000, metaphorically speaking, when God gives you the 200 grand to steward. But until then, all you've got is a desire to steward the 200 grand. Let me give you a couple of different ways to determine calling in your life. There's two different ways that you can see calling in your life. Here they are. Looking forward from where you are to something that might be out there in the future, and you're wondering if God has called you to this thing, here's how you know. It's got to be a confluence, a coming together of desire, gifting, and opportunity. Desire, gifting, and opportunity. So if any one of those is missing, if you have desire and gifting to do something, but God hasn't given you the opportunity to do it, you're not called to it. Not right now. You may be 30 seconds from now, but not yet, until God gives you the opportunity. If you desire it and there's an opportunity, but everybody around you is saying, you don't have the ability to do that, you're likely not called to that. That's one way you can determine calling in your life. Here's another way. The other way to see calling in your life, if that's even the right language to use, is look down at your feet. Wherever you're standing is what God has called you to do. Just look down at your feet. Take stock of what God has given you. Friend, that's your calling for right now. He may call you to something else in the future, but for right now, that's what He wants you to be doing. So do it, and do it well. Not as an idol, not in idleness, but do it with joy. Capitalize on it energetically. Here's number 4. What matters to God, finally, what matters to God is faithful, energetic service, not the size of the return. What matters to God is faithful, energetic service, not the size of the return. Now we're going to do a little corporate Bible interpretation here. So most of you have Bibles. Just like nod your head if you've got a Bible of some kind that you can read right now. Okay. So there's an aisle right here. So about half of us are over here, half of us are over here. This group right here, I want you to, in just a minute, all together, read verse 21. Okay. You can look at it. I want you to read verse 21. That's what the master says to the guy who made him $200,000 extra. You guys are going to read verse 23 at precisely the same time. This is what the master says to the guy who only made him $80,000. Okay, so not nearly as much as 200. So what we're going to have when we read all these together is this like cacophony of two different responses. See where this is going. Okay, you ready? Verse 21, verse 23, all at the same time. Cacophonous noise coming right here. Ready, set, read them. Okay, that's enough. That's enough. So you get the point. You could have kept reading for another 30 seconds that we don't have. The point is that what the master says to the guy who made him 200 grand is precisely word for word, even in the Greek, the same thing that he says to the guy who only made him 80 grand. It's not the size of the return that he was so worried about. It was those servants' faithful and energetic service with the responsibility that he'd given them. Now, even if you're the kind of person that would say, yeah, but the return rate was the same. They both returned 100%. It looks like in verse 27 that even had the guy stuck the money in the bank and gotten a return of like 4%, the master still would have been happy with him. So it's not the size of the return. It's faithful, energetic service. That's what matters. And you know that's true. That's true even if you don't particularly like the responsibilities that God has given you right now. What matters to God is that you serve faithfully and energetically in Him, knowing that you're doing those services, you're carrying out those responsibilities for Him, for the King. That's what matters to Him. I mean, and just think for a second about what's actually happened to you. If you're a Christian, here's what's happened to you. You were a rebel against King Jesus. King Jesus reinvaded the world in order to, you would think, wipe out the rebels. That's what everybody would have expected a king to do when there are rebels against him. You wipe them out. But that's not what he does. Instead of wiping out the rebels, he offers mercy to the rebels. And in fact says, the penalty that's due to you for your rebellion, I'm going to take that on myself and die for you and rise again. I'm going to secure your salvation. So imagine that the king is here and you're down there and you've been saved from your rebellion and you have this sense, you know that you ought to have been crushed by the king's army of angels. That's what should have happened to you for your rebellion. But the king calls you up, offers mercy, you take it from his hand, and he says to you, listen, now not only am I going to not crush you with this army that's behind me, not only am I not going to do that, I'm going to call you into my service. You're going to be a part of my army. And you're thinking, wow, that's incredible. I mean, not only have I been saved, not just to go back home and do nothing, but I've been called into the king's service to work for him after he's done all this for me. This is incredible. And so you step up to the king and you say, Lord, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? This is amazing. And the king says, all right, listen, I've got this plan that's working out through all the ages and over all the earth, and every bit of it I've got planned out. Every second, every page of it is written out in detail. And here's your part in it. I've known you were coming. Here's what I need you to do. I need you to go over there, and I need you to dig a trench 5 feet deep, all the way down the horizon until I tell you to stop. Now what sort of servant, knowing what the king had done for him, hears that assignment coming from the king and goes, God, I want to dig a trench? What the world? You know what you got here? I need to be a tank commander. Nobody does that. If you know that you've been saved from getting crushed by the army and now the king has saved you and you're being called into the army, you don't kick the dirt. You go skipping off to dig the trench because you love the king. I mean, some of you are kind of the opposite. I mean, you came before the king and the king said, I want you to command the tank. And you're going, oh, I want to dig the trench. I'm tired of commanding tanks. Same thing, friend. You don't kick the dirt when the king calls you to command a tank and say, I'd rather be digging a trench, Lord. You do what the king has said because you love the king. Here's number 5. Lack of energy. Lack of energy in your assignments, deployments, responsibilities is very often rooted in a failure of love for the king. A lack of energy in your assignments is very often rooted in a failure of love for your king. Think about the last guy. The last guy comes up before the king, and you remember what he says? He says, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, ruthless, selfish, unfair, and therefore I was afraid of you, and therefore I did nothing with the responsibility that you gave me. Do you see what his lack of energy in his responsibility was rooted in? It was rooted in the fact that he had a bad opinion of his master. He was non-energetic, non-engaged in his work and his responsibilities because he had a bad opinion, a low opinion of his master. He didn't love him like the other two did. The other two were energetic because they loved their master. And the responsibilities that were given to them, they did because of that love. The other guy didn't love him, and therefore he didn't do the work. You ever think about that? I mean, maybe one of the things you need to do over the next few hours is just kind of take stock. You know, if I have no energy, if I have nothing but discontent in the responsibilities that God has given me, is it possible that I just have lost sight of who the king is? And maybe, kind of surprisingly and unexpectedly, you would find that if you did some things, reading, quiet times, all the things that Christians know to do, to increase love for the king, and then connect that back up with the responsibilities he's given you, you'd see energy flourishing down here. Maybe you need to love the king more. One of my favorite stories in the whole Bible is the story of Joseph at the end of Genesis. And there are lots of reasons that I love the story. I mean, he's an incredible picture of Jesus, and he's this surprising thing having to do with God's sovereignty. Just all kinds of things are going on in that story. But one of the things that I love about the story of Joseph is, have you ever thought about how many jobs Joseph had throughout his life and how different they were? He had a ton of jobs. I mean, he got sold into slavery in Egypt, wound up being a slave in a guy's house. He rose up to be the head slave in a guy's house. He got into some trouble, wound up sort of cleaning the latrines in a prison in Egypt, worked his way up to being the head latrine cleaner in the prison, and then wound up being second in command of all, like vice president of Egypt, right? Vice regent, viceroy of Egypt. Just incredible, like 5 different jobs. And the thing is that the Bible says that in every single one of those jobs, he did them excellently, and the Lord blessed them in all those jobs. He put his hand to the work. He did every single one of the jobs excellently. He did vice president excellently, and he did latrine cleaner excellently every single time. Now, here's the question. Do you think that Joseph liked those jobs? Do you think he liked the jobs? Do you think he wanted to be in the jobs? Even vice president of Egypt, did he want to be there? I don't think he did. He wanted to be back home with his family. And the way you know that is because when he sees his brothers, even when he's viceroy of Egypt, he cries. He wants to be with his family. He misses. He wants to be back in Canaan. He doesn't like the job, but he does it excellently. Why? Every single one of those 5 different jobs, he does them faithfully and he does them excellently, not so much because he loves the job, but because he loves his God. That's why he does it. Lack of energy is often rooted in a failure of love for the king. Here's the last thing. Being a Christian is not, this is number 6, being a Christian is not just a matter of avoiding doing something wrong. It's a matter of burning up our lives for the glory of our king. Not just a matter of doing something wrong, it's a matter of burning up our lives for the glory of our king. That last servant thought that it would be good enough if he just took the talent that his master gave him and just protected it from loss. Don't let it get rusted, don't let it get destroyed, protect it from damage. Just avoid doing something wrong. He thought that would be enough. It wasn't. There are so many people who approach the Christian life that way. So many people who approach their responsibilities that way. Just don't break them. Don't do anything wrong. Don't mess it up. Don't hurt it. Don't harm it. Don't damage it. I'll return it to the king just as he gave it to me. Not having messed it up. But as far as going for it, as far as doing it excellently, as far as even taking some risks to do it well, that's not me. I have a 12-year-old son who plays 6th grade basketball. And if you've ever seen 6th graders play basketball, you know that it's just a dog ugly thing to watch. These guys are like, they're like bouncing the ball higher than they are, as they go. And they shoot the ball, if you can call it a shot, and it goes up. And usually, it's more likely it's going to like plinko down the back side of the backboard than hit anything on the front side. My son's an all right player. He's pretty good. But he does some ugly stuff every once in a while. He'll dribble the ball down, bounce it off his foot, bounce it off his knee, bounce it off his nose, whatever it does. It's just all kinds of stuff is happening, especially when he gets into a fast break situation. He puts up some ugly shots. But do you think when my son steals the ball, he's headed on a fast break, there's a really good chance he's going to mess this up and it's going to be ugly? Do you think that I'm sitting over in the stands going, oh my gosh, don't. Pass. No, I'm up on my feet. Like, go, baby, go. Throw it up. And when it goes to the back of the backboard, I'm doing the same exact thing next time because I want him out there going for it. I'm not going to sit in the stands with, I played basketball when I was a kid, and I was terrible at it. I sat on the bench the entire time. Like, me and my coach had an agreement that the only time I would get on the court is there were less than 2 minutes of the game, and one team was 10 points or more ahead. That's the way it is. It was at a cheering section that when those 2 criteria were met, they would start cheering. Put Greg in. Put Greg in. So when the coach did that, honoring our agreement, it looked like he was being charitable. So, it's just, I was terrible. Never played. But do you think my dad was up in the stands, like, punching his buddy whose kid was out, doing all this stuff? Do you think he was punching his buddy and saying, hey, you know how many shots my kid has missed tonight? 0. No, because a father, a parent, wants their kid out there going for it, even if it's ugly. Friend, same thing for you. God doesn't want you just to not mess it up. I want you to go for it. I want you to work with energy and faithfulness and love for your King in all the responsibilities that He's given you. Whatever you do, you work for the King. Do it well. Let's pray. Our Lord, we thank you that you are a sovereign God who loves us, who cares for us. We thank you that you've saved us, and we thank you that you've called us into your service. We pray, God, that you would help us to serve you with energy and faithfulness and love. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.